She was born into splendor but not destined for power. Anne of Bohemia came into the world in 1366, the daughter of Emperor Charles IV and Elizabeth of Pomerania, within the looming walls of Prague Castle, a structure that echoed with the weight of empires and the voices of Latin, German, Czech, and prayer. Her father, a scholar king who had made Bohemia the jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, valued intellect and piety as much as conquest. From him Anne inherited a love for learning, a respect for books, and a soft, deliberate demeanor that rarely fit the image of royalty in an age dominated by iron and ambition. Unlike her siblings destined for imperial politics, Anne moved through the stone corridors of her childhood more like a shadow than a torch. The imperial court of Prague was cosmopolitan and vibrant, alive with philosophers, diplomats, clergy, and merchants from across the continent. It was there that Anne's education began, flanked by governesses who taught her French and Latin, catechism and diplomacy, embroidery and equanimity. She watched silently as visiting envoys negotiated alliances and rivalries in the grand chambers her father built, absorbing lessons about the delicate dance between monarchs and ministers. From early on, she understood that her place in the great political machinery of Europe would not come from the throne she occupied but from the marriage she would make. For a royal daughter, the body was a treaty, the heart irrelevant, and the future always uncertain. Her father's death in 1378 would cast a long shadow across the Bohemian lands, but by then, Anne's life had already begun to drift westward. Whispers had reached the court that the young King of England, Richard II, was searching for a wife. At only 12 years old, Anne was considered suitable not because of wealth or military value. Her dowry was meager, but because she offered something subtler. Her brother Wenceslaus, King of the Romans, had ambitions that extended across Europe, and a marriage into the English Plantagenets would tie him to the affairs of the West. For Richard, whose own father, the Black Prince, had died when he was just a child and whose grandfather Edward III had only recently passed, the marriage offered a link to imperial legitimacy and, perhaps more crucially, a partner without dangerous English relatives. The proposal was met with scorn in many quarters of Richard's court. Critics derided Anne as a pauper princess. With no strategic dowry, no promised military alliance, no immediate political leverage. They argued that England, still wounded by the 100 Years' War and by the burdens of a child king, could not afford to waste a royal marriage on sentiment or speculation. But the match was made, and Anne, only 16, was told to prepare to cross the North Sea. The journey from Prague to London was more than a geographic shift. It was the passage from familiarity to myth, from the known rhythms of Bohemian prayer and court to the strange cadence of English politics, whispers of plague, and a kingdom where the people still dreamed of Edward III's conquests. The seas were cruel that year, and the storms that battered her fleet seemed like omens to those waiting anxiously in England. When she finally arrived in early 1382, she stepped ashore into a kingdom both expectant and uneasy. Anne's first impressions of England were not kind. The language was foreign, the customs awkward, and the court fractious. She was greeted not with fanfare but with suspicion, especially from those who had hoped the young king would marry a French princess or someone with a stronger claim to alliance and coin. But Anne did not react with complaint. She watched, listened, and quietly began to learn. Her crown weighed heavy on her head, not just in gold but in expectations she neither invited nor welcomed. Yet she wore it with a grace that confused and disarmed many at court. Richard II was 17, fair-haired, delicate, and already enamored with ceremony. In Anne, he found not only a queen but a kindred spirit. Both had been thrust into roles too large for their age. Both carried the burdens of dynasties already fading into the past. And both longed, perhaps foolishly, for beauty, art, and peace in an era that respected only strength. Their marriage, though arranged, slowly turned into something genuine. Richard would later refer to her as my cherished companion, and it was not mere flattery. Unlike queens who dominated by scheming or spectacle, Anne's power was made in silences and small gestures. She hosted literary salons, encouraged the copying of books, and introduced Bohemian customs to the English court. Her presence helped soften the rougher edges of a monarchy built on conquest. For a time, she and Richard cultivated an image of regal refinement. The English court began to reflect their mutual aesthetic: more tapestries, more poetry, more attention to manners. Chroniclers noted that the queen had a quieting influence over the young king, and ambassadors spoke of her as a gentle force amid the chaos. But the kingdom was restless. Beneath the elegance of court life, England simmered with discontent. Heavy taxation, corruption among royal officials, and tensions between the peasants and the nobility grew. In 1381, just months before Anne's arrival, the peasants' revolt had shaken the foundation of the realm. Richard's confrontation with the rebels at Smithfield had secured temporary calm. But the memory of pitchforks at the gates of London haunted the elite, and entered a world still in recovery, a kingdom more fragile than the crown jewels suggested. She saw the fear in the eyes of ministers and the distrust between barons. She understood that while she might not dictate policy, she could shape tone. Her influence with Richard, still modest but growing, would become a crucial part of how he viewed kingship, not as mere domination but as performance, symbolism, and, above all, legitimacy. Together, they began to model a different kind of monarchy, one that elevated the ceremonial, that emphasized divine right and aesthetic grandeur, that sought to remake the image of the king as a god among mortals. But not everyone agreed with this vision. Many in Parliament and among the magnates were deeply uneasy with Richard's obsession with royal prerogative and his apparent disdain for counsel. And, while beloved by the people for her charity and grace, was viewed by some as enabling a king who refused to share power. She never involved herself directly in political battles, but her presence gave Richard a sense of righteousness, an unspoken assurance that his reign was not only lawful but inspired. As their bond grew stronger, so too did the king's resolve to assert himself, and, in her own quiet way, became both muse and mirror. She showed Richard the gentler path, but she also fed his desire to rise above the squabbles of Parliament and the ambitions of his uncles. He wanted to be more than a boy in a crown. He wanted to be remembered, and continued to build a reputation among the people. She interceded in cases of mercy, distributed alms during times of famine, and visited the sick when outbreaks of plague returned to the towns. Her court was filled with Bohemian musicians and scholars, and she supported the expansion of libraries and translations of religious texts. Though she bore no children, a fact that would haunt them both, her influence was maternal in other ways. She nurtured an ideal, even as the reality around her darkened. By 1385, the political tide had begun to turn. Richard's strained relationships with his powerful uncles, particularly Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, deepened. The court divided into factions, and whispers of rebellion echoed through the shires. The House of Commons began to press for more oversight. As the king's behavior grew more erratic, many looked to and for reassurance. And she gave it not through proclamations but through presence. At processions, in churches, at festivals, she was always composed, always regal. Her calm became a kind of national balm. But even she could not hold back the storm that was coming. England and Richard would be tested in ways that neither youth nor poetry could withstand. And yet, through it all, and would remain at the center of the monarch's heart, a quiet queen whose influence would outlast her name, and whose death would undo the very man she once held together. To understand the tragedy of Richard II, one must first understand the grace of Anne of Bohemia. She was not the architect of empire nor the wielder of a sword. She was, instead, the breath between battles, the hymn beneath the herald's cry, the silence that made meaning of the crown. And in that silence, history would one day hear the echo of everything lost. When the snow melted in early 1383, the English countryside revealed not renewal but scars. The fields had yet to recover from the upheavals of rebellion, and villages once vibrant with trade and harvest now moved with a cautious hush. The kingdom had been stitched back together after the peasants' revolt, but the seams were visible to those who looked closely. And at the center of it all, inside Westminster and its adjoining palaces, Anne of Bohemia walked with silent purpose, slowly discovering how to flourish in a kingdom not entirely hers. She was still seen by many as the foreign girl with no dowry and little influence. But time was bending to her presence, and, though not loud in command nor grand in gesture, had become the breath of quiet between storms. Her court was modest by the standards of queens, but it was becoming a sanctuary for those weary of the scheming and venom that often marked political life. Artists, scribes, clerics, and even some reformist thinkers found refuge under her protection. She did not speak often in councils, nor did she impose her will on ministers, but she watched, absorbed, and remembered. It was in the domestic rituals that Anne's influence began to crystallize. She reshaped the image of queenship not through war or children, but through the elevation of the court's atmosphere. She revived interest in the chivalric ideal, not as a tool of war but as a code of civility. She encouraged translations of spiritual texts into English, indirectly fostering a literacy of conscience among the nobility and gentry. To many noblewomen, she became a model not of authority, but of devotion. And to the common people she was something rare. A queen who smiled, who offered coin without condescension, who visited abbeys in the countryside not for spectacle but to pray. Richard, still young and often uncertain in matters of state, leaned on and in subtle ways. Though he had advisers, some shrewd, some self-serving, it was Anne's calm presence that steadied him in moments of doubt. When Parliament grew restless or his uncles whispered in opposition, it was to and he turned in the privacy of their chambers. She did not offer strategy or statecraft, but something far more enduring, a vision of what monarchy could feel like, not just to those who held it, but to those who lived beneath it. Together, they began to shape a court unlike any England had known. It was less militaristic, more refined, and deeply conscious of image and symbolism. Richard's fascination with ceremony found in Anne a complement, not a contradiction. She encouraged the aesthetic elements of kingship, regal processions, architecture with classical flourishes, and poetic pageantry. Their shared love for literature, music, and visual beauty birthed a culture at court that emphasized divine right and elegance over brute authority. It was not a court of warriors, but of mirrors and tapestries, where every act was imbued with deliberate grace. To the political factions hardened by the long reign of Edward III and the legends of the Black Prince, this shift felt unnatural, even dangerous. They saw in Richard a monarch obsessed with appearances, disconnected from the harsher needs of war and governance. They whispered that the Queen's soft manners and Bohemian sensibilities were weakening the steel of the English crown. But they underestimated the quiet potency of Anne's example. In 1385, the court traveled north on a campaign to repel a rumored Scottish incursion. It was Richard's first significant attempt to lead a military operation, and though the threat proved illusory, the campaign became a turning point in his relationship with the nobility. His uncles, especially Thomas of Woodstock and John of Gaunt, chafed under his command, questioning his judgment and authority. Richard, in turn, grew suspicious of their ambitions, convinced they saw him as a puppet rather than a king, and did not accompany the northern campaign, but her influence followed. She had advised Richard to show mercy, to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and to remember that a crown was not just a sword, but a burden of care. Her words stayed with him, even as his advisers pushed him toward displays of dominance. When he returned to London, frustrated and humiliated by the campaign's political fallout, it was Anne who soothed the bruise of pride with the balm of reassurance. Yet the winds of politics were shifting faster than either could calm. Parliament had begun to flex its power more aggressively, pressing the young king for greater accountability and threatening the prerogatives he held sacred. A crisis was emerging, a slow, grinding confrontation between a monarch who saw himself as divinely anointed and a political structure that no longer worshipped unconditionally. Richard's response was to retreat deeper into the world he and Anne had built, a world of pageantry, ritual, and royal sanctity. In this world, Anne flourished. She sponsored religious plays, encouraged the building of shrines, and became known for her patronage of manuscript illumination. Her chaplains began to distribute translated sermons, some echoing the early reformist tones of her Bohemian homeland. Though she was never politically radical, she believed that faith should reach the hearts of all subjects, not just those cloaked in Latin and law. The movement of ideas that would later be called lolity found in her a quiet echo. Though she herself remained firmly Catholic, Outside the court, England's nobility grew increasingly alarmed at what they saw as royal extravagance and detachment. Taxes were rising, foreign wars loomed, and the memory of peasant rebellion had not faded. The nobility began to organize, preparing to challenge the king's inner circle, especially his favored counselors and the growing influence of his chamberlain, Michael de la Pole. And always cautious, saw the danger in this tension. She urged Richard to listen, to compromise, to allow Parliament its voice. But the king had become enamored with the idea of absolute rule, shaped not by the past but by a vision of sacred monarchy that transcended compromise. He imagined a court governed by loyalty, elegance, and reverence, not by tradition or precedent. He had seen the chaos of rebellion, the ingratitude of barons, and the fickleness of counsel. In Anne's steady presence, he found validation for his sense that a king must rise above all. By 1386, the conflict broke into the open. Parliament demanded the removal of de la Pole and threatened to withhold taxes. Richard resisted, dismissing the demands as treasonous. The crisis escalated into a constitutional confrontation, culminating in the appointment of a commission to oversee the king's governance, a move that deeply humiliated Richard. Through it all, and watched with growing dread, knowing that Richard's pride, once wounded, would seek retribution. Still, she remained his anchor. In the private moments between royal decrees and public appearances, she offered a vision of patience, of a path not yet consumed by vengeance. But even she could not prevent what was coming. The Lords Appellant, led by powerful magnates like Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick, were gathering strength. They were no longer content with managing the king. They were preparing to confront him directly, by force if necessary, and responded the only way she knew, not with political maneuvering, but with acts of quiet diplomacy. She visited households known to harbor resentment, appealed to wives and mothers of nobles who opposed Richard, and offered gestures of peace and shared grief. Her efforts softened some edges, but the core conflict remained unyielding. England was becoming a battlefield of principle, between the vision of monarchy Richard and cherished, and the old baronial order that refused to die. In 1387, the kingdom teetered on the edge, and watched as her husband drifted further from restraint, surrounded by loyalists who promised revenge. He no longer entertained Parliament's voices as a necessary burden but as an insult to royal dignity. His court, once refined, now grew tense, even paranoid. And Anne, ever composed, began to sense the fragility of everything they had built. But she never turned away. In public, she remained the Queen of Grace. In private, she tried to be the conscience that power no longer welcomed. She reminded Richard of mercy, of the promises they made to serve, not rule. And though he listened, something in him had begun to shift. The boy who once sought harmony was becoming a man determined to dominate history, and still believed that peace could be preserved, that a king could be both magnificent and just. But she was beginning to understand that love, however deep, could not hold back the tide of ambition. The crown they had polished together now gleamed with danger, and the thorns, once hidden beneath blossoms, were beginning to pierce the skin. Before Anne had even stepped foot on English soil, the earth beneath the throne of her future husband had already begun to tremble. The year 1381 marked one of the most violent domestic upheavals in English history, a raw and terrifying glimpse of a kingdom fraying from within. It was a revolt born not of foreign invasion or noble conspiracy, but of desperation, hunger, and the crushing weight of injustice pressed upon the backs of the common people. And though Anne would not arrive in England until the aftermath had settled into the annals of fear, the legacy of that summer of revolt would shape the nation she entered, and the man she would marry, for the rest of their lives. The peasants' revolt, though commonly referred to in simple terms, was anything but a singular, unified movement. It erupted first in Essex and Kent, swelling rapidly into a storm of anger that marched toward London with frightening speed. The people, laborers, artisans, villains rose in fury against the poll tax, against feudal bondage, against the crushing weight of a system that offered them no path to dignity. They bore no clear banners of political reform, Instead, they carried scythes, pitchforks, and grievances that had simmered for decades. Their cry was not for ideology but for recognition. Richard II was only 14 when the rebellion exploded. Still grieving the death of his grandfather Edward III and standing in the long, cold shadow of his father, the Black Prince, he was a boy thrust suddenly into the full heat of kingship. His advisors flailed, nobles scattered, and London itself became a city under siege as the rebels entered its gates. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer were both executed by the mob. The Tower of London, once thought impregnable, was breached. Panic took hold not only of the court, but of the kingdom's very idea of order. It was in this crucible of chaos that Richard made a choice that would define his early rule. He rode out to meet the rebels, alone and unarmed, at Mile End and then again at Smithfield. There, face to face with what Tyler and the fury of a broken nation, he promised reforms, freedom, and peace. He did not stammer or flee. In that moment, a boy became a king, at least in the eyes of a people desperate for justice. But the promises he made to buy time, were swiftly revoked. Tyler was killed, and the rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency. Heads rolled, villages burned, and the social order, though shaken, was reinstated with iron. By the time Anne arrived in England in early 1382, the kingdom was still haunted by the revolt's smoke. Noble families had fortified their estates. Tax collectors were more cautious and Parliament moved with the stiffness of trauma. Though outward peace had returned, it was a peace forged in fear, not trust. The city walls were watched with new vigilance. And the young king, now married and beginning his public life with and carried the weight of those events silently behind his ceremonial smiles. Anne, freshly arrived from the cultured courts of Prague, stepped into this atmosphere with an empathy rare among the crowned. She had not seen the rebellion, had not smelled the fires or heard the chants of revolt, but she understood its human cost. Her father had governed a diverse empire filled with tensions, religious, economic, and cultural, and she had learned early that mercy, though sometimes scorned by nobles, had a long memory among the people. She began to ask questions that unsettled some at court. What had driven the peasants to rise? What grievances had gone unaddressed? Was there a way to rebuild trust without another wave of executions? In private, she read the accounts of the revolt, not with the cold detachment of a monarch, but with a searching curiosity. She spoke with clergy who had walked among the poor. She listened to servants who whispered what their families had endured. And when she began to speak to Richard about these things, she did not challenge his decisions, but she posed quiet alternatives. Could leniency achieve what force could not? Could a queen's touch mend the rent that a sword had widened? Her interventions were never direct, and was too wise to attempt public persuasion in a court that still viewed foreign women with suspicion. But her influence began to ripple through the choices Richard made in the years following the revolt. When a handful of former rebels were caught in the shires and pleaded for clemency. In several cases, pardons were granted. When Parliament debated new taxes, she urged Richard to seek compromise rather than confrontation. And though he often ignored her advice, he never dismissed it. The common people noticed. Stories began to circulate of a queen who spoke kindly, who offered alms without ceremony, who visited parishes without entourages of armed men. In London, mothers pointed to her with reverence, and in the countryside, her name was invoked in prayers for justice. She had no army, no loyal faction among the lords, but she had something rarer: the quiet trust of those who had nothing left to give. Richard, still recovering from the wounds of rebellion, found in Anne a source of emotional ballast. She did not soothe him with praise, but with presence. When he doubted his advisers, she listened. When he bristled at Parliament's demands, she reminded him of patience. She became not just his wife, but the moral compass he returned to when pride led him astray. Their love deepened in these years, not through grand gestures, but through the mutual refuge they offered one another in a court beset by tension. As Anne grew into her role, she began to quietly reshape the court's relationship with the kingdom. She sponsored churches in areas devastated by the revolt. She supported literacy programs through monastic houses, believing that knowledge could blunt the edge of desperation. She encouraged preachers who emphasized compassion over punishment, and she urged Richard to consider reforms not as concessions, but as investments in the crown's future stability. But not everyone welcomed this softer vision. Many of Richard's uncles and noble advisers viewed Anne's influence with suspicion. They feared her subtle hand in policy, her effect on Richard's increasingly idealistic notions of kingship. To them, a monarch was a hammer, not a harp. They believed the revolt had been crushed only by force, and that only greater force could prevent another. Anne's gentle diplomacy was seen as a dangerous indulgence. The tension came to a head during discussions of further taxation in 1383. Richard, emboldened by Anne's counsel, proposed a more measured levy that exempted the poorest. Parliament resisted. The nobility bristled, and for the first time, Anne found herself the subject of direct criticism. Pamphlets circulated claiming she weakened the king's resolve. In whispered corners, her foreignness was weaponized. A Bohemian queen telling England how to rule its own, and responded not with defiance, but with devotion. She increased her visits to parishes, expanded her charitable giving, and doubled down on her efforts to present the monarchy as a source of care, not fear. In time, her popularity among the people only grew. She was now seen not merely as Richard's wife, but as a symbol of what the monarchy could be: a partner in peace, a steward of mercy, a queen who did not command but inspired. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened. Richard, though still young, was beginning to internalize a dangerous lesson that he and he alone understood what was best for his kingdom. Anne's counsel of moderation became one voice among many, and he began to selectively hear only what confirmed his own rising sense of destiny. Still, Anne remained by his side, believing that love could temper power, that patience could outlast wrath. She was not wrong, but she was not entirely right either. The kingdom remained fragile, its peace a thin film stretched over deep resentments, and had slowed the descent into tyranny. But she could not prevent it entirely. The revolt of 1381 had been crushed, but its causes remained. And in the heart of the king, bruised by betrayal and praise alike, a fire still smoldered. And had walked into a country just after its most dangerous awakening, and she had offered a vision of healing. But as the years unfolded, she would find that healing was not enough to satisfy a king raised amid ghosts and surrounded by daggers. And though she never wavered, she would come to see that mercy, too, had its price. By the late 1380s, the English court had become a maze of rivalries and whispered betrayals, gilded in ceremony but hollowed by suspicion. The corridors of Westminster echoed less with the laughter of nobles and more with the quiet pacing of men who weighed each word spoken, fearful of who might be listening. It was a time when alliances were as fragile as glass, and every glance carried the weight of potential treason. And in the midst of this increasingly volatile court, Anne of Bohemia moved like a soft wind through iron gates, quiet, steady, and often underestimated. Her influence was not rooted in decrees or political maneuvering but in presence. She had grown from the tentative young bride of a boy king into a figure of gentle command, a woman whose very restraint gave her power. In a court where voices were raised to intimidate and titles were wielded like weapons, Anne's refusal to engage in such games made her impossible to dismiss. She was not a queen who competed. She was a queen who endured. Richard II, now in his early 20s, had begun to assert his authority with more confidence and, increasingly, with more resolve. He saw himself not as the inheritor of a throne but as the embodiment of divine kingship, chosen, sanctified, and above reproach. The memory of his grandfather, Edward III, still loomed over him, and the exploits of his father, the Black Prince, were legend. Richard had no victories on the battlefield to equal theirs, but he sought a different kind of triumph, one of image, law, and control. Anne, ever at his side, supported this vision not out of ambition, but because she believed in the sacred nature of monarchy as a moral calling. Yet even she could see the dangers gathering. The nobility, particularly Richard's uncles, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, and John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, were growing increasingly wary of the king's inner circle. Chief among their concerns was Michael de la Pole, a commoner elevated to Earl of Suffolk and the king's closest advisor. To the old nobility, de la Pole represented everything wrong with Richard's court: favoritism, extravagance, and the erosion of their traditional influence. and who had always held herself above factional politics, now found herself silently navigating the divide between her husband's chosen companions and the lords who believed the kingdom was being steered toward ruin. She had no natural allies among the English aristocracy. Her foreign birth remained a point of subtle scorn, her inability to bear children an unspoken disappointment, and her gentle demeanor mistaken by some as passivity. But Anne understood something few others did. Power could be wielded in whispers, in glances, in the careful arrangement of a chapel visit or the quiet endorsement of a rising cleric. She began to expand her court with women of intelligence and discretion, cultivating a space where conversation was elevated above gossip and where loyalty was measured not by declarations but by character. Through her chaplains and confessor, often with marginal notes urging reflection and compassion, her influence in matters of religion became quietly significant. She protected priests who preached reformist messages, though always cautiously, and she supported hospitals, leper houses, and convents in forgotten corners of the realm. To the poor and the sick, she was more than a queen. She was a presence of mercy in a world that had little of it to spare. Court, however, mercy was in short supply. In 1386, the brewing tensions came to a head in what became known as the Wonderful Parliament. Pressured by Gloucester and a growing faction of lords, Richard was forced to remove de la Pole from office. It was a public humiliation, one that the king never forgot. Anne, who had counseled moderation and compromise, watched as her husband grew colder and more calculating. His belief in the divine sanctity of his rule became not a shield but a sword. If he was chosen by God, then opposition was not just rebellion, it was blasphemy, and began to sense a change in him. The warmth that had once marked his early reign, the open-handed generosity of a boy who wanted to be loved, was giving way to something harder, more brittle. He no longer sought approval. He demanded obedience. And while he still adored Anne, still turned to her in moments of doubt, he was increasingly closed off from counsel. The court became stratified between the trusted few and the watched many. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly. Dissent was noted and remembered. In 1387, the Lords Appellant, led by Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel, took matters further. They accused several of Richard's closest advisers of treason, including de la Pole, and began to raise arms in what amounted to a veiled coup. Richard, attempting to muster resistance, found little support. The Lord's forces defeated the royal army at Ragot Bridge, and Richard was forced to submit. The following year, the merciless Parliament oversaw a brutal purge. Several of Richard's allies were executed or exiled. It was the most severe political reckoning of the king's reign, and it happened with and powerless to stop it. She had pleaded privately for clemency. She had wept in chambers behind drawn curtains, begged her husband to forgive, to yield, to find another path. But he could not, or perhaps he would not. The humiliation of being forced to watch his servants condemned by his enemies had left a mark deeper than policy. It was personal, it was spiritual, and tried to be his solace. But she could not be his shield. The England that had once seemed poised for a flowering of royal peace had instead turned on itself with a ferocity that left even the most cynical observers shaken. In the aftermath, Anne retreated further into her devotions. She expanded her patronage of religious houses, commissioning prayers not just for the kingdom's health but for its soul. She took in orphans of noble families ruined by the purges. She spent hours in silent contemplation at St. Stephen's Chapel, dressed in the simplest fabrics, head bowed beneath the flickering light of sanctuary lamps. Those who saw her in those moments remarked that she looked less like a queen and more like a nun, detached from the courtly noise, tethered instead to something eternal. Still, she remained vigilant, and did not abandon the court, nor did she abandon Richard. She knew his wounds, knew the fear that now fueled his ambitions. She stood beside him during public appearances, her poise unshaken, her gaze calm. She made it her mission to project continuity, to assure the people that their sovereign, though battered, still ruled with divine favor. And in that she succeeded. Despite the chaos behind palace walls, the monarchy endured and was its most stable symbol. But stability was not peace. The court had become a place where memory was weaponized and loyalty was tested daily. Richard's trust in others narrowed until even longtime allies felt the chill of suspicion. New favorites emerged, more pliable, more flattering. Anne observed them closely but said little. She understood that her husband needed validation, even if it came from men who lacked integrity. She tried, whenever possible, to steer his attention toward more noble pursuits, rebuilding churches, supporting the arts, promoting education. But these efforts felt increasingly like stitching silk across an open wound. Outside the court, discontent lingered. The scars of the merciless Parliament had not faded, and those who had wielded the axe now found themselves feared rather than respected. Gloucester, once triumphant, was increasingly isolated, and, despite her careful neutrality, was seen by some as the only moral compass remaining near the throne. She became the person to whom nobles and bishops appealed when all other doors were closed. She never promised intervention, but she always listened. By 1389, Richard began a slow, methodical reclamation of power. With the Lords Appellant weakened by internal divisions and popular support wavering, he reasserted his authority, and watched this return not with elation but with concern. Though it restored the appearance of royal strength, it also marked the beginning of a darker transformation. Richard would never again govern with openness. From this point forward, his rule would be marked by a simmering need to punish, to remember, and to dominate. And still Anne remained. She did not flinch. Even as the man she loved began to harden into a monarch the realm would one day fear. She continued her quiet work, educating young women, funding chapels, translating spiritual texts. She reminded Richard of mercy, even when he no longer sought it. She lit candles for his soul, even as he plotted revenge. Her love was not blind. It was deliberate, and in her own way she was preparing, not for a triumph, but for the long, slow descent she feared might be inevitable. The court was now quiet in a different way. The shouts had faded, but so had the laughter. Power had become a performance, and every gesture was calculated. But amid the hollow grandeur, Anne of Bohemia remained a figure of sincerity, a gentle power in a court grown violent, a queen who had chosen not to flee the fire, but to walk through it with grace. By the winter of 1387, England stood at a precipice. Snow covered the fields beyond London, muffling the sounds of hoofbeats and steel. But within the city, the chill in the air was not of the season. It was the kind that seeped from walls when power begins to crack. A reckoning loomed, not from foreign invasion or divine wrath, but from within the very heart of the realm. The Lords Appellant had risen. The king's closest allies had been named traitors. The kingdom teetered between monarchy and aristocracy, and Anne of Bohemia, Queen of England and daughter of emperors, found herself caught in a storm that she neither summoned nor could fully deflect. But she would try. The year had begun with tension. Parliament was increasingly defiant, and the Lords Appellant Gloucester, Arundel, Warwick, Bolingbroke, and Mowbray had come together to form a coalition that was both legal in structure and revolutionary in aim. They did not seek to dethrone Richard, not yet, but they demanded control of his council, the removal of his closest confidants, and the restoration of what they considered constitutional balance. They feared Richard's pursuit of absolutism, his reliance on favorites, and his growing obsession with the divine right of kingship. What they sought, in truth, was to strip the crown of its autonomy and cage it in custom. Richard, in his youth, had once been to Parliament, but not now. He saw their defiance not as political dissent, but as betrayal of the most sacred order of the realm. And behind his eyes burned a determination shaped by years of humiliation. He would no longer bow. He would fight, and knew this battle had been inevitable. She had seen its outlines take shape over the past years, the gradual hardening of her husband's stance, the open disdain of Gloucester, the tightening of loyalties around camps that no longer spoke in veiled language but in direct accusation. And though she had no command of armies or writs of law, she understood that what was coming would define the soul of the monarchy itself. It would test the limits of her influence, of her faith, and of her endurance. In private, she pled with Richard to yield, to outmaneuver the lords not with confrontation but with wisdom. She had seen, in her father's court in Prague, how pride could shatter dynasties and how compromise, even when bitter, could preserve legacies. But Richard was no longer inclined toward patience. The The memory of the wonderful parliament still burned in him, and the thought of once again standing helpless while others dictated the shape of his rule was intolerable. In the early weeks of conflict, Anne sought allies. Quietly, discreetly, she began to write letters to bishops, to noblewomen, to clerks and abbots who still held some loyalty to the crown, not to incite rebellion or challenge the lords directly, but to preserve bridges. She knew that in war, there would be victors and casualties, but beyond war, there would still need to be reconciliation. She labored to keep lines of communication open, hoping to maintain at least the possibility of peace. But peace slipped further from her reach. In December of 1387, the king's forces, under his favored courtier Robert de Vere, met the appellant's army at Radcot Bridge. De Vere was defeated and fled to France. The humiliation was total. Richard's enemies now controlled military power, the confidence of Parliament, and the authority to demand trials for those closest to him. A new Parliament was summoned, not in the king's image but in his enemies. It became known as the Merciless Parliament. The name was no exaggeration, and stood beside Richard as the walls of his authority collapsed inward. His friends, men who had dined with them, shared prayers in the chapel, carried messages through palace halls, were arrested, dragged into chambers of accusation, and condemned. Some were executed. Others fled into exile. Their only crime, in many cases, was loyalty to the king. She watched as Richard's face transformed, not with rage, but with a cold, terrible stillness. There was no fury in his silence, only a calculation, a measurement of every insult absorbed, every humiliation endured. And still, he did not openly resist. He attended sessions of Parliament, heard the charges, and signed the sentences, and knew it was not submission, it was delay. He was waiting. In these weeks of despair, Anne became more than consort. She became shield. She intervened personally with the lords, requesting clemency for some accused. She made appeals in the Queen's name, invoking not politics but compassion. In some rare instances, her voice spared a life, delayed a sentence, allowed a moment of dignity in death. It was little, but in a court stripped of pity, it mattered. Behind palace walls, she worked to keep Richard from falling into despair. She maintained the daily rhythms of court life. Masses said, petitions heard, musicians rehearsed, meals served. These rituals were not denial, they were survival. In a time when treason was defined by whispers and alliances shifted with the hour, the Queen's household remained a rare sanctuary of calm, to servants and nobles alike, and became the emblem of continuity, of quiet resistance to a world unmaking itself. Yet she felt the toll. In private, her health began to suffer. Sleepless nights wore at her, and bouts of faintness interrupted her prayers. Physicians urged her to rest, but she refused. She believed, perhaps rightly, that if she withdrew, Richard would collapse into himself. She feared what would rise in his heart if he no longer saw in her a reason to believe in justice. Her presence did not go unnoticed. Even her enemies acknowledged her dignity. In Parliament, no accusations were made against her, no rumors floated through the city streets of treason or conspiracy. Instead, she was viewed with a certain reverent caution, an empress's daughter who never interfered but always lingered just beyond the reach of vengeance. Her name became a kind of silent rebuke to the bloodletting around her. When the merciless Parliament finally ended in May 1388, the kingdom it left behind was unrecognizable. Richard remained king, but his sovereignty had been gutted. The lords appellant returned to their estates, content that the machinery of monarchy now answered to them. The court was subdued, almost funereal, and Anne, exhausted but undeterred, resumed her work of mending. She rebuilt her household, re-established court ceremonies, and resumed her patronage of religious houses. She organized almsgiving campaigns in the towns devastated by recent conflict. She encouraged the restoration of hospitals, the printing of devotional texts, and the hosting of reconciliatory masses between rival factions. These were not grand gestures of power, but small acts of stewardship. rooted in the belief that monarchy was not merely a throne but a service. Richard said little, but he watched, and he remembered. In the years to come, he would bide his time. The Lords Appellant would grow complacent. Parliament would tire of shared rule. And slowly, methodically, Richard would begin the long process of reasserting himself. Not in rebellion, but through law, through appointments, through the careful accumulation of loyalists. When he moved again, it would not be in desperation, it would be with calculation. And saw this. She recognized the shift in him. The coiled patience, the narrowed gaze, the deliberateness of each gesture. He had learned something in the merciless Parliament, something dangerous, that if he could not defeat his enemies in open war, he would dismantle them in silence. She feared it, but she also understood it. She had shielded him as long as she could, had stood between him and the blades of his enemies. But now she saw that he no longer wanted protection. He wanted vindication. And though she would remain at his side, ever the voice of mercy, she sensed that her days of influence were waning. The court quieted in the years that followed, but the silence was not peace. It was waiting, and, ever faithful, prayed not for victory, but for grace. In the shadows of vengeance, she kept alight the final flickers of hope. In the spring of 1389, as the chill of the merciless Parliament finally began to thaw, Richard II emerged from the ashes of humiliation with a face that few at court recognized. He had not changed in form. Still slender, still pale, still wearing the silken robes that had come to define the ceremonial air of his kingship. But something within him had hardened, calcified under the pressure of restraint. He moved through the halls of Westminster with the patience of a chess master, not a wounded king. His defeat had not broken him. It had refined him. And as he stood before his council in May of that year to declare his intention to resume personal rule, it became clear to all that the boy king of England was gone. He was 22. Anne of Bohemia stood beside him that morning, dressed in modest pearl-lined velvet, her hands folded, her head bowed slightly, not in subservience, but in solemn acknowledgement of what was being set into motion. She had seen the path he had chosen long before others did, in the way he listened but no longer responded, in the way his silence had begun to speak louder than any proclamation. She had counseled caution, but she knew it was no longer hers to give. Richard had stepped beyond the reach of advice. What he needed now was space. What she could still offer was grace. To the outside world, Richard's announcement appeared tempered, even wise. He thanked the Lords Appellant for their service, spoke of unity and stability, and pledged to govern in consultation with Parliament. But beneath the surface of civility, every word carried the tremor of calculated resolve. Richard had learned the language of his enemies. He had memorized their rhythms, their fears, their blind spots. Now he would use those lessons to rebuild what had been taken from him, piece by piece, until the crown was once again undisputed, and watched his campaign unfold with a steady heart. She remained a quiet presence at court, offering no interference, issuing no proclamations, but always visible. Her mere appearance at council dinners, at processions, at the Easter court at Windsor, reminded all who looked that the king was not alone. She was the living emblem of continuity, and her gentleness softened the edges of Richard's return to power. But she saw what others missed. Richard's vengeance would not come with swords, it would come with time. He began by restoring loyalists to key positions, judges who had been removed, clerks who had been silenced, bishops whose sympathies aligned with the divine right of kings. He made new appointments with the care of a scribe copying scripture, each name chosen not for popularity but for loyalty, and noted every move. Though she rarely intervened, she kept a mental ledger of those whom Richard had once loved, now called back into the fold with a quiet nod. The court was being rebuilt not as a chamber of council, but as an instrument of will. Outside the walls of Westminster, England stirred with uncertainty. The memory of the merciless Parliament still hung like smoke in the air. The lords who had triumphed in 1388 now found themselves stranded between past glory and present vulnerability. Gloucester, once the shadow king behind the scenes, became increasingly isolated, his influence waning as Richard avoided direct confrontation, but stripped him of power through omission. Arundel returned to his estates, watching carefully. Bolingbroke, the young Earl of Derby and son of John of Gaunt, remained cautious but sensed the shifting winds. Only and could move among these men with any measure of welcome. She visited their wives, exchanged letters with their households, offered prayers for their dead. She kept the old bonds warm, even as her husband quietly cut their threads. Anne's caution in these years became more pronounced. She increased her patronage of religious institutions, expanded her almsgiving, and sponsored masses for the kingdom's peace. She sought to remind the people that the crown, though resurgent, had not forgotten its obligation to mercy. She championed the repair of hospitals damaged during the years of unrest, funded the translation of devotional texts into the vernacular, and met with abbots and priors to discuss the spiritual health of a realm still bleeding from within. She also grew more reflective. Her time in England had taught her the limits of influence, the fragility of goodwill, and the necessity of restraint. She no longer tried to shape policy, but she shaped tone. Her presence alone changed conversations, made men think before they spoke, reconsider before they accused. In a court where fear was beginning to eclipse faith, she was the last symbol of unshaken conscience. Privately, Anne's health continued to decline in waves. The pressures of the court, the long nights spent in prayer, the emotional labor of maintaining a fragile calm, all took their toll. She suffered occasional fevers, moments of faintness, and increasing fatigue. But she refused to retreat. She believed that to disappear would be to abandon not just Richard, but the vision they had once shared, of a kingdom ruled by virtue as much as by law, by dignity as much as by force. In 1390, she persuaded Richard to embark on a royal progress, a journey through the southern counties to meet with nobles, hear petitions, and reassert the crown's presence beyond London. It was not only a political act but a symbolic one. Together, they appeared in towns and villages still bearing the scars of revolt and suppression. The people lined the roads, cheering not with feverish loyalty but with cautious hope. They remembered Anne's kindness during the years of vengeance, and they saw in her return the possibility of peace. The progress also allowed Anne a temporary reprieve from the suffocating politics of Westminster. She visited monasteries, schools, and women's houses of charity. She met with abbesses who had read her father's writings and who spoke to her of Prague as a light of learning. In these encounters, she felt the brief return of her youth, the echo of ideals that had once felt within reach. But each night, as they returned to the royal camp, she saw in Richard's eyes that the dream had changed. He no longer sought harmony. He sought control. Richard began to speak more openly about divine kingship, not merely as theory, but as the central fact of his rule. He commissioned new emblems, new regalia, and new pageantry to reflect the elevated nature of his crown. His speeches began to adopt the tone of oracle, not servant. He was not unjust, not yet cruel, but he was distant. The weight of betrayal had calcified into certainty, and tried to temper this transformation not through argument but through example. She reminded him of charity, of the obligations of justice, of the memory of his mother, of the humble beauty of their early days. But Richard no longer looked backward. He looked upward. That same year, he began construction on Westminster Hall's hammer-beam roof, a marvel of architectural ambition, intended not only to awe but to proclaim the permanence of his reign. It was a building shaped like his mind, majestic, intricate, and unyielding, and supported the endeavor, raising funds through her own household to contribute. But she saw in the stone and timber not just a monument, but a warning. Richard was building legacies, not alliances. He was securing posterity, not trust. Back at court, the old lines of power had been redrawn. Gloucester was increasingly marginalized. Parliament, still summoned each year, was now more ceremony than contest. The royal household expanded. Pages and clerics loyal to the king's vision were promoted. Anne's chaplains, once consulted on matters of conscience, found themselves pushed to the periphery. And while she retained respect, her influence waned. Even Richard, though always tender toward her, had begun to move without her. Still and persisted, She did not protest the distance, nor lament the fading of her voice. She understood that her role was no longer to advise, but to remain. She was the quiet heart of the monarchy, the pulse that kept the illusion of virtue alive even as ambition overtook devotion. She continued her work among the poor, her correspondence with religious figures, her sponsorship of music and art. She focused on beauty as balm. By 1392, the court had achieved a superficial tranquility. The king was unchallenged. The lords had either submitted or retreated. The people, weary of upheaval, accepted the silence. But Anne felt the tension in that stillness. It was the kind of silence that comes before the breaking of glass. She knew that Richard had not forgiven. He had merely postponed. She knew that his vengeance, once released, would not be theatrical. It would be surgical. And she feared not only for the men who had wronged him, but for the soul of the man she loved. She began to pray not just for peace, but for deliverance. From pride, from wrath, from the lonely righteousness that isolates kings from mercy. She prayed in long vigils, sometimes alone in cold chapels lit only by flickering oil. She prayed not for herself, but for Richard, that the burden he carried might not crush him. That the love they had built in youth might outlast the hunger for legacy. But deep within her, she sensed a limit. She had walked beside him through rebellion, humiliation, recovery. But she was growing weaker and the court colder. She feared what would happen when she was no longer there to whisper the truths others dared not speak. And so, even as Richard rose and began to fade not in stature, but in spirit, the kingdom looked toward its king and saw strength. But in the quiet corners of the palace, the Queen of England and of Bohemia lit a final candle, placed it beside a worn icon, and offered a silent prayer not for the triumph of power, but for the endurance of love. The rhythm of governance, once pulsing with tension and conflict, began to slow by the mid-1390s. On the surface, England was quiet. No armies marched. No barons openly defied the crown. The fields were green, the markets busy, and the ports alive with ships that bore trade and promise from across the channel. The kingdom, so long burdened by rebellion and faction, seemed at last to exhale. Yet behind the carved wooden screens of Westminster Hall and beneath the stained glass windows of royal chapels, an invisible battle played out not upon parchment or soil, but in the inner chambers of the king's heart. Anne of Bohemia, ever the silent queen, felt its tremors long before the court did. Richard's power was now secure. Parliament had become an echo chamber, shaped less by debate and more by deference. The Lords Appellant had been dismissed, disgraced, or disarmed by law. Royal councils sat in reverent stillness. The machinery of the realm turned without friction. But power, once held, demanded purpose, and Richard began to struggle with the burden of what to do with his unchallenged will. Authority without resistance became not peace but a vacuum, and into that space rushed the voices that had long whispered only in the shadows. Pride, vengeance, and the yearning to be remembered. He spoke less often of justice and more of legacy. His gaze turned not outward but upward, to the heavens, to Rome, to the great emperors of the past who had ruled not merely nations but imaginations. Richard now fancied himself their heir, not only by blood but by spirit. The Plantagenet king who had once wept in private humiliation during the merciless parliament now wore his crown as though it had been forged by angels. Ceremonies became longer, more ornate. His robes grew heavier, his throne taller, his proclamations wrapped in language that blurred governance and prophecy. He was no longer merely a ruler, he was becoming a figure of myth. And, ever watching, felt the shift not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Richard, though still affectionate, began to withdraw from her world. He no longer shared the details of council discussions, no longer paused to ask her counsel after evening prayers. He loved her still, that much she could see in the way his hand lingered on hers during feast days or in the glance he gave her when music from Bohemia played in the great hall. But his love had become a memory, something cherished and set aside, like a relic brought out for ceremony but no longer carried daily. She remained faithful to her duties. She continued to meet with abbesses, to oversee almsgiving, to pray with the poor and to sponsor the copying of sacred texts. But her influence, once quiet but central, had begun to dim. Younger women filled the court now, ladies who knew how to flatter, how to praise the king's vision, how to smile at his growing sense of divine grandeur. They dressed in gold-threaded silks and practiced the art of reverent laughter, and did not compete with them. She watched them gently as a mother watches birds she knows will not survive winter. Her own body had begun to betray her more openly. The fevers returned with greater regularity, sometimes accompanied by breathlessness that made chapel vigils nearly unbearable. She bore them in silence, refusing to speak of weakness in a court that worshipped spectacle. But each time she rose from her pallet in the pre-dawn hours, each time she forced herself to appear for Mass, she knew the threads holding her to this world were fraying. And still she remained. She saw the signs of transformation in Richard not only in his public acts, but in his absences. He began to disappear into his own designs, literal and figurative. His mind wandered often to plans for buildings, for new regalia, for chronicles that would place his reign among the celestial. He spoke to scribes and heralds about how future generations would remember his wisdom, his beauty, his divine clarity. He ordered that his personal emblems, white hearts, golden suns, and celestial arches, be carved, sewn, and painted across every surface of royal life, and recognized the language. It was not madness, but isolation, the kind that comes when a soul believes it no longer has peers. She feared not the man he had become, but the loneliness that consumed him. In the quiet hours of the evening, she tried to draw him back, not with reprimands but with memory. She would recall the early years of their marriage, the simpler days when they had walked the gardens of Eltham Palace, speaking of books and justice and mercy. Sometimes he smiled and nodded. Sometimes he turned away. There were nights when he would leave her alone for hours, walking the palace corridors in candlelight, murmuring psalms or dictating passages to scribes. He seemed to grow more devout, but also more insistent that divinity answered only to him. And who had been raised among theologians and philosophers understood the danger of this drift. The king who believes himself sacred ceases to listen to the sacred voices of others. Richard's soul, once tender and open, had begun to crystallize. And yet he was not cruel. Not yet. In public, he continued to show kindness, especially to children and the sick. He visited shrines, offered charity, and oversaw the rebuilding of structures long neglected. He appeared generous, even joyful, but sensed the split, the surface benevolence masking a core that had grown weary of being questioned. A heart that now beat not to serve, but to endure, to rise, to conquer memory itself. In these years, Anne became less a participant in Richard's court and more a relic of its origins. She was treated with reverence, spoken of in tones reserved for saints or statues. Her chambers remained full of gifts, of offerings from across the realm, silks from Gascony, oils from the Levant, tapestries from Flanders, all sent in tribute to the queen who had never wielded power but who had held it together. She accepted them with grace, but she longed only for silence, for the comfort of familiar prayers whispered in familiar rhythms. One winter evening, she returned to the chapel alone and lit 3 candles, one for the kingdom, one for her husband, and one for the child she had never born. She had come to accept that no heir would come from her womb, and she had made peace with that sorrow years ago. But as Richard ascended further into his self-fashioned heaven, she mourned not the absence of children, but the absence of anchoring, the simple, grounding love of family, of the familiar. By 1394, Anne had become pale with more than devotion. The court physicians whispered of wasting illness, of humors and weakness of the lungs, but no cure was found. She began to withdraw more frequently to Sheen Palace, a quiet retreat beside the Thames where she could watch the river bend and feel the rhythm of the seasons. Richard visited often, bringing poets and musicians, hoping to lift her spirits. He read to her from illuminated texts, brought her new rings, ordered choirs to sing her favorite Bohemian hymns. But her smile had become thinner. She knew the end was coming, not in tragedy but in the slow, gentle way that trees lose leaves in late autumn, inevitable, natural, and without fanfare. She did not fear death. What she feared was what her absence would unleash. She had watched Richard walk a narrowing path for years, each step closer to a vision of kingship that left no room for contradiction, no space for softness. And she knew, with a clarity sharpened by failing strength, that when she was gone, the last mirror that reflected him in full humanity would shatter. There would be no more warnings and glances, no more reminders from hands clasped in prayer. Only the throne, only the crown, only the echo of his own voice. In her final letters to her brother Wenceslas, she asked for prayers not only for her soul but for England. She wrote of a country she had come to love, not for its power or wealth but for its people, for the quiet monks of York, the fishermen of Kent, the weavers of Norwich. She wrote of the villages where children still called her name when she passed, of the poor who gave her flowers without expectation. She wanted it all to endure, to flourish, to be more than the stage for one man's ambition. And then, as spring approached, Anne of Bohemia grew still. She died in June 1394, at Sheen Palace, surrounded by few but remembered by many. Her death was not marked by omens or great celestial events. It came with the quiet finality of a page turned in a treasured book. She was 28 years old. When Richard heard, he did not weep publicly. He did not speak for hours. He ordered the destruction of the chamber where she had died. The walls were torn down. The name Sheen was forbidden from being spoken in his presence. He wore mourning robes longer than custom required. But the grief that gripped him was not just sorrow. It was a severing, and had been his companion, his conscience, his tether to the world of shared humanity. With her gone, the unseen battle within him ended. And what remained was not peace, but sovereignty, absolute and alone. The Queen was dead, and with her, the last gentleness of Richard's soul. The Queen had died in silence, but her absence thundered across England in ways that no proclamation could contain. At Sheen Palace, where her final breath escaped into the hush of summer, no song was sung, no bell tolled immediately. The wind that moved through the Thames carried no sound that day, only the slow ripple of time adjusting itself to a world without Anne of Bohemia. She had been more than a consort, more than a royal presence. She had been a fixed point in a court that never stopped turning, a sacred stillness inside a kingdom built on noise. Now she was gone. When Richard II received word of her passing, his face did not contort in grief, nor did he cry out as others might have. Instead, he stood motionless in the gallery of Westminster, staring at the floor for so long that even his closest attendants dared not speak. Then, with a calm that was colder than morning, he gave his first order. The chamber at Sheen where Anne had died was to be destroyed, stone by stone. No one was to utter the name of the palace in his presence again. The word Sheen became a wound, a ghost, a curse. He left London not long after, retreating into travel under the pretense of royal progress. But it was not governance he sought, it was distance. Grief followed him in every cathedral, in every pageant, in every gilded prayer book handed to him with trembling hands. He ordered a period of mourning that stretched far beyond custom. Courtiers dressed in black not for days or weeks, but for months. The Queen's funeral, held with solemn magnificence at Westminster Abbey, was a pageant of royal sorrow, but it could not reach him. Even as he processed behind her bier, Richard seemed unmoored from the world that moved around him. Something within him had broken, and it did not heal. In the weeks following Anne's death, Richard became increasingly solitary. He dismissed many from his inner circle, retreating to private chambers where only his most trusted scribes and confessors were allowed. Meals were taken in silence. Court audiences were delayed or cancelled altogether. When he did appear in public, his expressions were unreadable, neither wrathful nor benevolent, but vacant. The court, uncertain of how to respond, grew quieter with each passing day. Rituals continued, but the soul of the palace had dimmed. No one filled the space and had left. No one could. Her former household was kept intact, its rooms undisturbed as if she might return. Her personal chapel remained lit with candles. Her favorite psalter was laid open permanently on its stand. These were not acts of honor. They were denials defenses against the truth that the only person who had ever held Richard's full trust was gone. And with her, the last restraint on his darker impulses. The following year, Richard began to act with unprecedented confidence, issuing orders with a finality that brooked no debate. Parliament, long subdued, was now openly subjugated. Its members were carefully selected, its acts pre-drafted. He no longer asked, he declared. Policies were introduced without discussion. Taxes were raised to fund projects that bore no explanation. Nobles who had once dared to challenge his authority were summoned and made to kneel, often under veiled threats or silent reminders of the crown's growing reach. He moved through his kingdom as though it were a stage, his every gesture imbued with theatrical holiness. Processions became longer, more elaborate. Robes and regalia increased in weight and meaning. He wore symbols not of England alone, but of empire. Golden suns, white hearts, and radiant halos adorned his garments. He issued proclamations that described his rule in mystical terms, placing himself not beside God, but beneath no man. He was no longer content with kingship. He desired sanctification. Without end, there was no one to remind him of humility, no one to whisper conscience into his solitude. Her absence was not just emotional, it was theological. She had been the bridge between Richard's vision of kingship and the real, suffering, mortal people of England. Without her, that bridge collapsed. He no longer walked among his subjects with curiosity or care. Instead, he descended upon towns like an idol passing through a temple. The court transformed accordingly. Old counselors were replaced with new, often foreign, advisors, men who flattered the king's divine pretensions, who spoke of destiny and eternal memory. Architects were summoned to redesign palaces in ways that reflected cosmic harmony. Plans were drawn up for a tomb that would rival Charlemagne's, a final resting place for a king whose soul, he insisted, was touched by heaven. Chroniclers were instructed to write not merely history, but hagiography. Every aspect of Richard's rule became an act of devotion to himself. The nobles watched in silence, some confused, some afraid. Those who had once dared to stand against him, Gloucester, Arundel, Warwick, sensed the change, but did not yet see the sword poised above them. Richard had grown adept at masking intention. He smiled more often now, spoke in tones of reverence, even blessed those he met. But his eyes gave nothing away. What once had been light behind them was now reflection only, smooth, perfect, impenetrable. The people, too, shifted in their perception. Some adored him, seeing in his magnificence a return to order, a ruler who stood above the petty squabbles of the barons. Others feared him, noting the silence that followed his decrees. The disappearances of former lords, the rising number of spies and informers in every parish. The realm, though not openly oppressed, felt the weight of a crown that now hovered like judgment rather than governance. And still Anne's memory lingered. In markets and churches, people spoke of her with quiet reverence. Her charities continued. Her chapels held services in her name. Her death had not made her distant, it had made her sacred. For many, she became the last good thing they could remember in a court that had grown cold. Her name became a prayer on the lips of the poor. Her face a comforting vision in the stained glass of village churches. Richard, for all his efforts to transcend mortality, could not escape her ghost. She lived in his dreams, in the echo of her footsteps on marble floors, in the scent of her favorite incense that lingered in the chapel air. He tried to replace her, not with another queen, but with symbolism, with art, with grandeur. But none of it sufficed, and had not been a concept. She had been a presence. In her stead, he married again Isabella of Valois, a child bride from France. No older than 9 when the wedding took place. It was a political arrangement, one meant to secure peace with France. But Richard did not love Isabella. He adored her in the way a king adores a cathedral window, fragile, beautiful, untouchable. He dressed her in fine fabrics, paraded her in public, but she did not enter his inner life. That space remained occupied by silence. The death of Anne had not merely grieved Richard, it had unbound him. Without her, there was no one left who could speak to the man beneath the crown. And so, the crown consumed the man entirely. By 1397, he would strike with precision and fury, dismantling the last remnants of the Lord's appellant in a sweep of arrests, executions, and exile. Gloucester would be murdered, Arundel beheaded, Warwick banished. Bolingbroke would soon follow. Each blow fell not only with vengeance, but with righteousness. The king believed he was correcting the sin of betrayal, restoring the cosmic balance his enemies had disturbed. He had become, in his mind, not a tyrant, but a judge. But those judgments had begun with loss, with the silent death of a woman who had loved him beyond ambition, who had asked only for mercy, for humility, for peace. In the years that followed her passing, Richard would raise monuments, rewrite histories, and redefine his reign. But what he could never restore was what he had lost in that quiet room at Sheen, the anchor of love that once kept the crown from floating away into myth. The queen was gone, and in her place rose a king whose soul now belonged to no one, not to his people, not to his God, and not even to himself. It was not ambition that shaped Richard's descent into tyranny. It was grief, calcified over time into a doctrine of control. The king who once wept at altars now ruled as if the throne were an altar itself, and all who entered his presence were supplicants to a god cloaked in ermine and gold. He no longer sought counsel. He expected obedience. And while England's fields still bloomed in spring, and bells still rang in market towns, a new chill settled over the kingdom, the chill of fear dressed in silence. By 1397, 3 years after Anne's death, the full transformation of Richard's court was complete. What had once been a stage of cautious collaboration between crown and nobility had become a theater of submission where applause was required and criticism fatal. Richard, now 30 years old, had waited nearly a decade to reclaim his full power, and when he did, it was with the resolve of a man who no longer believed in limits. His enemies had faded into the background, or so it seemed. The Lord's appellant, those who had humiliated him in the merciless Parliament of 1388, still lived, scattered across the realm like embers waiting for wind. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, was the most dangerous among them, a man whose royal blood and defiant pride had once dictated the kingdom's politics. Arundel and Warwick, too, still moved with cautious intent. Richard watched them for years, biding his time, letting their confidence bloom just enough to make the pruning more satisfying. In the summer of 1397, he moved. The arrests were swift and without preamble. Gloucester was taken under the pretense of a royal summons and imprisoned at Calais. Arundel and Warwick were seized days later, their estates confiscated before indictments were even drafted. Richard called a new parliament, hand-picked, primed, and reverent, passed the charges with barely a murmur. Arundel was executed after a mockery of trial. Warwick was exiled. Gloucester never returned from Calais. Officially, he died of natural causes. Unofficially, all knew the king's hand had pressed the pillow. The kingdom shuddered, not with rebellion, but with the kind of fear that paralyzes rather than provokes. The nobility, stunned by the precision of Richard's purge, fell into line. The commons, long silenced, murmured obedience. The church offered prayers for divine wisdom, and through it all, Richard remained unshaken, his gaze fixed not on what had been destroyed, but on what could now be created. He declared his intention to rule without parliament for as long as it pleased him. He created a private guard, an elite force of several thousand men, loyal only to him. He increased taxes without formal consent. He rewrote laws to suit the crown's convenience. He ordered that all major decisions pass through his household, not his councils. He named himself above custom, beyond precedent. And England, weary of conflict, yielded. He filled the court with men who echoed his vision. Young, ambitious, foreign, or marginal men without estates, but with appetites for patronage. They rose quickly, displacing the old nobility, reshaping the center of power into a circle of flatterers and opportunists. Their loyalty was total, but brittle, held not by affection but by dependency. They spoke of Richard as God's deputy, of his words as gospel, of his judgment as eternal. Their praise was a balm to his soul, a substitute for the quiet wisdom that had once come from Anne's presence. But Richard did not love them. He used them. He loved only one thing now: control. To solidify this control, he turned to spectacle. Royal entries became quasi-religious ceremonies. He processed through towns with choirs, torchbearers, relics. His clothing shimmered with symbolism: gold suns for divinity, white hearts for purity, flaming swords for justice. His court became a pageant of sacred rule. His speeches steeped in prophetic cadence. And everywhere he went, he carried the memory of a crown stolen once by rebellion, now worn with vengeance. He ordered the construction of a new tomb beside Anne's, lavish and towering, intended to rival any royal resting place in Europe. Their effigies were to lie hand in hand, sculpted in alabaster, their faces calm, their bodies united. It was not affection that drove him to this. He did not grieve as before. It was legacy, in death, and would become part of his narrative. The eternal queen beside the eternal king. He built their tomb not as a monument to love, but as proof that even in sorrow, Richard shaped history. But beneath the majesty, rot spread. The kingdom could not long endure the weight of personal monarchy. The machinery of local governance stalled under the king's centralization. Petitions went unheard. Justice slowed. Corruption bloomed. Those who once served with independence now operated in fear, afraid to offend or delay. The distance between crown and subject widened until only silence could span it. And the nobles, though cowed, had not forgotten. Among them was Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, cousin to the king, and once a reluctant participant in the Lord's Appellant. He had survived Richard's vengeance, in part through caution, in part through favor inherited from his father. But in 1398, after a dispute with Thomas Mowbray, Bolingbroke was accused of treasonous speech. Rather than allow the matter to reach bloodshed through a duel, Richard intervened, banishing Mowbray for life and Bolingbroke for 10 years. When John of Gaunt died months later, Richard seized his estates, denying Bolingbroke his inheritance. The message was unmistakable: even the blood of kings was not immune. The nobles did not protest. But they watched. They saw that lineage was no longer protection, that justice had become a servant to the king's mood. Bolingbroke, once exiled, now became a symbol not of rebellion, but of balance, of lost legitimacy. Across England, whispers returned. Some asked if Richard had gone too far. Others wondered if Bolingbroke might one day return. But Richard did not hear them. He traveled to Ireland in 1399, seeking to crush resistance and extend his majesty to the western edge of the Isles. He left England convinced of his permanence, of his invincibility. He believed no man would dare rise while he wore the crown. He was wrong. While he marched through the forests of Leinster, Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire. He came not as a usurper, but as a son seeking his father's rights. The nobles, long silent, rallied. Not with shouts, but with open gates. Richard's tyranny had left no affection to resist him. The kingdom, once tamed by awe, now yawned open beneath his feet. When word reached him, Richard hesitated. He delayed. He sent mixed orders. He returned to England not as a king at the head of an army, but as a monarch chasing shadows. He was captured without a battle. His fall was as swift as his rise. Parliament, called once more, voted to depose him. Accusations were read. Abuses listed. His crimes were recited in formal language. His vengeance, his extravagance, his disregard for counsel. And in 1399, the man who had ruled as a god walked down from his throne and signed away his crown. No tears were shed. He was taken to Pontefract Castle, held in a cold chamber with few attendants. There were no pageants there, no songs, no sermons of divine rule. Only stone walls and the knowledge that even kings, once unmoored from love, could drown in the sea of their own reflection. Some say he starved. Others say he was murdered. All agree he died alone. But before death, in the final hours, it is said he asked for one thing: Anne's Psalter. The same book she had read from during her vigils. The same pages she had turned with reverent fingers during the quiet battles of his youth. He held it in his lap, and for the first time in years, He wept not as a king, but as the boy who had once believed he could rule with love. The tyrant was born of grief, and in the end he died not with the defiance of a despot, but with the silence of a man remembering the only voice that ever called him home. The wheel of monarchy turns not only with lineage, but with perception. In Richard's reign, that perception had once been crafted with precision. Gold-threaded cloaks, heavenly emblems, solemn processions through flower-strewn streets, but by the spring of 1399 even the most dazzling symbols had lost their power to command loyalty. The kingdom had grown numb beneath the weight of ceremony, and when the time came for the return of Bolingbroke, it rose not with banners and blood, but with resignation. It began quietly, as such reckonings often do. Henry Bolingbroke, exiled by royal decree and denied his rightful inheritance, returned from the continent with a small retinue, fewer than 300 men. He did not announce war, did not call for rebellion. He landed in Yorkshire not as a challenger to the crown, but as a dispossessed son seeking justice. It was not ambition that rallied the realm behind him, but Richard's absence, an absence both physical and emotional. While the king lingered in Ireland, chasing Irish chieftains and phantoms of grandeur, England had fallen out of love with its monarch. The barons, once bound in terror to Richard's will, now saw in Bolingbroke a different kind of promise, not of glory, but of grounding. He spoke plainly, moved deliberately, and made no grand claims. He merely asked for his rights, his father's lands, his family's honor. The people, weary of royal abstraction, responded with gates swung open and silence turned to nods. Castles that had once trembled before the king now welcomed his cousin without contest. The sheriffs stood aside. The commons did not resist. No army rose in Richard's name. When word of Bolingbroke's arrival reached the king's encampment in Ireland, Richard hesitated. He refused to believe the news at first, dismissing it as rumor, the product of jealous minds. But the reports multiplied, and when he finally accepted the truth, his response was not immediate. He lingered in Ireland, paralyzed by indecision, perhaps still convinced that his divine authority would be enough to stop time. By the time he boarded ship and returned to England, the kingdom was already shifting beneath him. He landed in Wales to find no army waiting. His messengers returned empty-handed or did not return at all. The nobility had aligned with Bolingbroke. The church, silent but watching, did not intervene. Parliament prepared to meet, not with reverence, but with judgment. Richard, once master of spectacle, now wandered from fortress to fortress, finding no refuge. Even his most loyal companions urged surrender. The myth of his invincibility had cracked, and the man behind the myth stood revealed as uncertain, cornered, and utterly alone. They captured him not with swords, but with inevitability. He was taken first to the Tower of London, that ancient prison which had once stood as a monument to Plantagenet pride. There, under guard, he was compelled to watch as Parliament assembled to decide the fate of the crown. He offered no resistance, only a request to speak. They allowed it, and he addressed the assembly with solemnity, acknowledging the will of God, the desires of his people, and the shifting tides of fortune. But there was no redemption in his words, no plea for mercy, no poetry in defense, only quiet resignation. He relinquished the crown. A document was drawn up listing the offenses of his reign, the abuse of royal prerogative, the unlawful taxation, the execution of noblemen without trial, the silencing of Parliament, the exile of Bolingbroke, the confiscation of estates, the indulgence in personal vanity, the betrayal of England's legal traditions. But beneath those formal indictments was a simpler truth. The people had grown tired of a king who no longer saw them. Bolingbroke ascended, not in triumph, but in gravity. He became Henry IV, the first of the Lancastrian kings. His coronation was marked by tempered ceremony, stripped of excessive display. He did not speak of divine right. He spoke of duty. He pledged to restore the balance Richard had broken. And though some questioned the legality of his claim, few challenged it. The crown had passed from Richard not by conquest, but by abandonment. Richard was moved from the Tower to Pontefract Castle, a fortress of thick walls, gray skies, and long winters. There, stripped of authority, he became a memory in the making.
He was no longer addressed as majesty. He no longer held court. The echoes of power that once trailed his every step faded into stone.
The silence that had once guarded his grandeur now imprisoned him. In those final months, he kept little company. A few monks, a handful of guards, a steward who remembered Anne's gentle laugh. It was said that he asked for her psalter every day. He read from it not as a king preparing sermons, but as a man searching for language to contain regret. He spoke less, ate less, moved only when necessary. There was no defiance in his exile, only fatigue. Some say he fasted himself to death, embracing martyrdom. Others say he was murdered, starved by command or struck down to prevent a loyalist uprising. The records do not agree. His body was returned to London under cover of darkness. His funeral arranged without pageantry. The effigy atop his tomb, crafted years earlier by his command, showed a serene face, carved in alabaster, lying beside Anne of Bohemia, their hands forever joined in stone. It was the only tenderness left in the memory of his reign. But the England he left behind remembered him not as the husband of Anne, nor the golden boy who stood before the rebels of 1381. It remembered a king who reached too far, listened too little, and clung to majesty when only mercy could have saved him. The courtiers who once embroidered his symbols into every wall now served a new king. The clerks who had copied his proclamations in gold ink now erased his name from legal records. His emblems, white hearts, suns, golden stags, were stripped from the walls. His pageants were forgotten, his songs unsung. Only in quiet churches did his name sometimes rise again, in whispered prayer,
or in cautious elegy spoken by those who remembered the king before the fall. But Anne's name lingered longer. She was remembered not for what she said, but for what she softened.
Not for what she commanded, but for what she endured. The peasants still told stories of her kindness. The monks still copied her favored prayers. In the silent halls of her patronized abbeys,
her image remained a queen who never reigned, but who ruled hearts. And those who had watched Richard in his later years, detached and wrathful,
would sometimes murmur that all had begun to unravel the moment and died. History would debate his legacy, tyrant or visionary, martyr or madman, but none could deny that something sacred had been buried with her. The return of Bolingbroke had ended a reign, but it had also revealed how fragile majesty becomes when it floats too far from grace. Richard had once believed himself touched by the divine, chosen by fate to raise England above the petty quarrels of barons and bishops. But in chasing heaven, he had lost earth. In reaching for legacy, he had let go of love. And when the kingdom called him back down, there was no voice left to answer.
Pontefract Castle stood like a gray tooth in the northern hills, gnawed by wind and time, weathered by the long breath of centuries. Its walls were thick, its towers squat and somber. There had been a time when such a place would tremble before the approach of a monarch, when its gates would swing open not for a prisoner, but for majesty wrapped in crimson. But in the early months of 1400, it welcomed no such pageantry. It received instead a silent figure, cloaked and weary, who once sat on a golden throne and heard the music of angels in Westminster Abbey. Now he was simply Richard of Bordeaux. No crown, no court, no voice in the affairs of the realm. He arrived under guard, but not in chains. His captors knew the danger of a spectacle. Better to let him vanish quietly, buried not in dirt but in forgetfulness.
They gave him a room, a chamber of cold stone, a narrow window, a fire that sputtered against the damp, and left him there to contemplate a kingdom no longer his. There were no courtiers, no scribes,
no musicians, only silence and the occasional scrape of a meal tray across the floor. At first, Richard did not speak. He paced. He prayed. He stared out the window,
watching the clouds shift over barren trees. He listened for voices, half expecting the rustle of Anne's gown behind him, the familiar rhythm of her footsteps in the corridor. But she did not come. And slowly, the sound of her absence filled the room more completely than any presence could. He began to relive the memories in order, as if organizing a manuscript no one would ever read. He remembered her arrival from Bohemia, a foreign girl with soft eyes and a scholar's soul. He remembered the sound of her voice reading by candlelight, the hush of her breath during Mass, the warmth of her hand in winter when the world around them felt too brittle to bear. He remembered her caution, her pleas for mercy, her silences in the face of madness. And he remembered losing her suddenly, mercilessly, like a door slammed shut by a wind he could not stop. She had been gone 6 years now. Her tomb lay in Westminster beside the one he had built for himself in advance, an effigy of 2 lovers joined in sleep, carved from alabaster, untouched by time. He had commissioned it before his fall, in the days when he still believed that memory could be shaped by sculpture, that death could be conquered by stone. But here, in Pontefract, there were no sculptors, there was no audience. The only eyes that saw him now were his own reflection in the basin each morning, and the indifferent glances of guards changing shifts. At night, he dreamed of her, not in the ceremonial robes of a queen, but in the plain wool dresses she wore when she walked among the poor. He saw her face behind veils of snow, heard her laughter in the creaking of old beams, felt the softness of her palm pressing against his temple when the fever dreams rose. Sometimes he thought she was still alive, hidden somewhere in the castle, just beyond a wall that he could not pass through. Other nights, he awoke in a sweat, terrified that he had forgotten the sound of her voice. He kept her psalter beside his bed. It was worn now, its pages smudged and fragile. He turned them slowly each day, whispering prayers not to God but to her. He did not pray for deliverance. He prayed for remembrance, that he might be seen not as the tyrant scribes now wrote about, not as the traitor Parliament condemned, but as the man she once believed in. The man who, for a few fleeting years, had ruled with kindness, had dreamed of beauty, had tried clumsily, vainly, to build a kingdom of peace. No one came to visit. Henry IV had seen to that. There would be no courtly sympathy, no noble displays of compassion. The new king was cautious, his legitimacy still fragile, and Richard's continued existence was a shadow too long to tolerate. The silence that Richard once used to command reverence had become the silence of erasure. He began to write, using scraps of parchment provided by the steward. Not letters, there was no one to write to, but lines of memory, lines of confession, lines of poetry. He wrote of gardens in spring, of candlelight in chapels, of the quiet dignity of a queen who never raised her voice. He wrote of fear, of loss, of the aching loneliness that followed power once it left. He did not ask for justice. He did not plead for mercy. He simply recorded, as if writing down his days might keep them from disappearing. He remembered the moments he had failed her. The times he had dismissed her quiet warnings, ignored her subtle glances, drowned her calm in the noise of vengeance. He had thought himself divine. She had only ever asked him to be good. And now, in the narrowing days of his life, he saw her not as the queen of his court, but as the keeper of his soul. Without her, he had become a monument to what happens when grief is given a crown. One evening in February, the guards brought his meal and found it untouched the next morning. They said he had lain there peacefully, eyes closed, psalter on his chest. Others claimed he had been murdered, that a dagger had done what starvation could not. The truth, like the man, was buried quietly. His body was returned to London, transported without ceremony. Henry IV allowed a public burial, perhaps as a gesture of finality. There were no chants of mourning, no great crowds, only a trickle of priests and a handful of courtiers who remembered the boy who once stood in the face of rebellion and spoke of peace. He was laid beside and in Westminster, the tomb completed now. The story sealed in stone. The alabaster effigies show a couple resting side by side, hands entwined, faces serene. But history does not lie with marble. It lives in memory, in the hearts of those who knew and loved, who suffered and survived. Richard was not remembered with affection, nor was he wholly cursed. He was, in the end, a man who sought glory and found solitude, a king who built palaces from ideals and burned them with pride, a soul that rose too far and fell too fast, but and remained. Her name survived in hushed stories passed down in country churches, in the stained glass windows she commissioned, in the psalters she had copied for nuns and widows. Mothers named daughters after her, hoping for gentleness in harsh times. Priests spoke of her mercy in sermons about grace. She had been the quiet in the noise, the restraint in the storm. And even in death, she ruled where Richard had only reigned, in the hearts of those who still believed in the power of goodness. Together, they lay beneath stone, but only one was remembered as peace. The tomb at Westminster Abbey stood complete, cold, and eternal. A pair of alabaster effigies resting beneath an ornate canopy of gilded stone. Their hands were clasped, their faces untroubled, their robes sculpted with the folds of dignity and piety. Visitors to the abbey would sometimes pause before it, drawn not by political significance but by something quieter. There was a kind of stillness in the air around that tomb, a hush that even the choirs above could not pierce. Richard and Anne lay there side by side, but history had already judged one and sanctified the other. In the years following Richard's deposition and death, the realm moved quickly to forget him. His name became an uncomfortable footnote, a warning taught to young princes about the dangers of excess, of pride, of ruling by fear. Henry IV, eager to secure his hold on the crown, ordered that chronicles be revised, titles redistributed, and heraldic symbols quietly replaced. The White Hart was no longer seen in public processions. The golden suns that once blazed across royal standards faded from view. The age of Richard II was closed like a locked book, not to be reopened. But Anne endured, not in the pages of law or in the vaults of governance, but in the hearts of a people who remembered the touch of her compassion. In Norfolk, a hospital she had once restored expanded its wards. In Kent, her name was still spoken in the churches where she had quietly funded stained glass for the poor. In Oxford and in monastic scriptoria across the south of England, psalters copied at her behest continued to circulate, their margins filled with Bohemian flourishes and gentle prayers. She had never issued a royal decree, never passed a law, never led an army, but she had touched the country in ways no act of parliament ever could. Her legacy was not one of conquest or reform, but of presence, and had been an anomaly in an age of noise, a woman whose silence had weight, whose calm steadied the storm. She had never argued with Richard in public, never resisted his authority, never staged a rebellion of thought. But her influence had been deeper than that. She had been his mirror, reflecting back not his power, but his humanity. And when she died, that reflection vanished. What remained in Richard was unchecked certainty, untethered belief. In that void, tyranny grew. The scholars of later centuries would debate how much Anne had truly shaped the course of Richard's reign. Some argued she had merely delayed the inevitable, that his fall would have come regardless of her presence. Others claimed she had held him together, not with policy, but with love, with dignity, with a restraint he did not possess alone. But among the people there was no debate. They remembered her not through theory, but through gratitude. In Bohemia, her homeland, word of her death had reached the court with sorrow. Her brother, King Wenceslaus, had mourned her quietly, commissioning masses in Prague and sending offerings to English abbeys. For a time, her name bridged two worlds, a reminder that even in an age of political calculation, there had been a woman who moved between empires not as a diplomat or pawn, but as a gentle soul whose influence flowed beneath the surface. She was not canonized. The Church, wrapped in its own politics, never placed her among the saints. But in the minds of many, she held that place anyway. Her image began to appear in devotional manuscripts, not as queen but as intercessor. A woman kneeling before the cross, her head bowed, her hands clasped, her face serene. Artists gave her the features remembered from those who had seen her in London, in Canterbury, in the quiet lanes of the countryside. Kind eyes, a modest veil, a mouth that never needed to speak to be heard. Time, as always, moved on. Henry IV would die, succeeded by Henry V, the warrior king who would restore English glory at Agincourt. He would be followed by Henry VI, a boy king of deep piety and tragic weakness, whose reign would plunge the realm into civil war. The crown would pass from house to house. Lancaster, York, Tudor, each claiming legitimacy, each rewriting the past to suit the needs of the present. And amid those shifting banners and bleeding fields, few paused to remember the man who had once declared himself divinely chosen. Richard became a shadow, and remained the light within it. Centuries later, a visitor to Westminster might stand before their tomb and feel the paradox. Here lay a king and queen, bound in death, divided in memory. His story was one of warning, hers of quiet triumph. He had ruled through spectacle and perished in obscurity. She had walked unseen and lived on in hearts. The world had changed since their time. Monarchs no longer walked among peasants with divine claim. Queens no longer arrived from distant courts to marry boys not yet men. But the longing for kindness, for restraint, for humanity within power that never faded. And in that longing, Anne's legacy remained alive. She had taught a kingdom not by edict, but by example. She had spoken for mercy in a court obsessed with might. She had given love to a man who would one day lose himself in the echo of his own voice. And though she died young, before her 30th year, her life had outlasted armies, her silence louder than any cry. History did not raise monuments in her name, but the truest monuments were the moments she changed without fanfare. The execution delayed, the exile softened, the child comforted, the widow heard. She was, in every sense, a crown of silence. And in the end, it was she, not the sovereign, not the throne, not the chronicler, who left behind the most enduring truth. That gentleness is not weakness, that restraint is not absence, and that even in a world built on power, it is love that lasts the longest.